Prepare for a rude awakening.
Shalom, Torah fans. This is Michael Rood in the Golan Heights overlooking the beautiful Sea of Galilee. In today's episode, we are going to attempt to solve another apparent contradiction in the Gospel of Matthew. In the Greek and English text, Yahshua instructs his disciples to ignore a specific commandment in the Torah, which would nullify a prophetic instruction of Jeremiah and prevent the Gentiles from entering the kingdom of heaven. If the Greek text is accurate, Jesus is in violation of the very mission that the Messiah must fulfill. Fortunately, the ancient Hebrew text of Matthew's Gospel tells quite a different story. Once again, my guest from Israel, Dead Sea Scroll scholar Nehemia Gordon, with episode 8 in the 10-part series, Raiders of the Lost Book, Discoveries in the Ancient Hebrew text of Matthew's Gospel.
Let's look at one passage here, one passage that particularly caught my eye. This is Matthew 5:33-37. It says there in the Greek, "Again you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, 'Do not break your oath, but keep the oath you have made to the Lord. But I tell you, do not swear at all.'" And here, very explicitly, Jesus is saying in the Greek not to swear at all. It's an absolute prohibition, if you're a disciple of Jesus, to swear, to make any kind of oath. And in fact, you can go to any court in the United States where there's the practice of putting your hand on the Bible and saying, "I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help me God." And you could tell them, "I'm a devout Christian, a disciple of Jesus of Nazareth, and because of that I can't swear, because Matthew 5:34 tells me I may not swear." And they won't think you're trying to pull a fast one, and they'll tell you, in fact, there's a standard formula for someone who's a devout Christian who's allowed to say, "I affirm to tell the truth." And no one's going to think you're trying to pull a fast one or lie, because it's a standard thing that many devout Christians actually do. They won't swear because Jesus says do not swear at all. He goes on, "Either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. Simply let your yes be yes, and your no, no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one." Who's the evil one? Okay, we'll use that as a working definition. You're defining him as Satan. We won't get into that whole question, though. So Satan, if you say anything beyond yes or no, then you are from Satan, according to the NIV translation of Matthew 5. And what that means is if you say, "I swear by Jerusalem, yes, I will do such and such," you are from the evil one. And if you say, "I swear by heaven, I will not do that," you are from the evil one. Well, I had a real problem when I saw this, because I said, okay, that doesn't really sound something wrong with this. And the reason I had a problem with this for me really began in Exodus 3:15. And many years ago, I was studying in Jerusalem under a Karaite sage named Mordechai Alfandari. And he was a very brilliant man. He would never try to convince you of anything. He would just present you the scriptural verses, and you would see that he was always right. And one day, he sat me down, and he said, "Nehemia, read to me Exodus 3:15 out loud." And I said, okay, I'll read it to you out loud. Now, bear in mind, being raised as a Pharisee, there were certain things that had been so ingrained and so I'd been taught, and I just couldn't break free from them for many years, even after I became a Karaite, because, these things had been ingrained so deeply. And you tell me, after I've done reading this, what Pharisaical practice I'm expressing here. And back then, I'd read this verse to Mordechai, following my Pharisaical indoctrination. "And God said further to Moses, 'Thus shall you say to the children of Israel, Adonai, Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial from generation to generation.'" So what did I say anything wrong there? I said Adonai instead of what it actually says there. In fact, it says there in the Hebrew, Yud He Vav He, which I pronounce as Yehovah, others pronounce as Yahweh or Yahweh. And I won't go now into the reasons for those differences. But it's very clear that the letters in Hebrew are Yud He Vav He, Yehovah, or Yahweh. And I had read it following the rabbinical ban on the name as Adonai, which is Lord. And in fact, in all of your English Bibles, or most of your English Bibles, you'll have capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, which following this rabbinical ban on the name. In fact, in the Hebrew text of Scripture, the name of the Creator, Yehovah, appears 6,828 times. Nearly 7,000 times. That's an average of approximately 7 times in each page of the Hebrew text of Scripture. And every single instance virtually that you read in your English Bibles, you'll see it's translated as Lord, capital L-O-R-D, in small caps, which is simply the translation of Adonai. And this comes from a rabbinical ban on the name. In the Mishnah, it explains that anybody who reads that name according to its letters and not as Adonai has no portion in the world to come. So there's an absolute ban on pronouncing the name of the Creator that the Pharisees teach. In fact, most Pharisees today refer to the name of the Creator as the ineffable name of God. Ineffable means unpronounceable. You may not pronounce this name. I was taught with my mother's milk that the greatest sin that I could possibly do was to say the name of the Creator. That was utter blasphemy to say His name out loud. And I was taught to say Adonai. And even after I went to the Scriptures and became a Karaite, turning just to the Hebrew Scriptures, this was something that was so deeply ingrained that when I read this verse, I ended up reading it, Lord, this is my name forever, and this is my memorial from generation to generation. Even though right there in front of me were the Hebrew letters Yud He Vav He, Yehovah. Now, when I realized this, the words of the prophet came to mind, they have eyes, but they do not see. And I was talking about myself. The letters were right there in front of me, but being so indoctrinated and this being so deeply ingrained, this ban in the name, I'd read it as Lord. Now, what about the end of this verse, Exodus 3:15? It goes on, it says, this is my memorial from generation to generation. Yehovah is His memorial. What does that mean, memorial? Today only dead people have memorials. So what's His memorial? That's just a horrible translation. The word that they translate as memorial, the Hebrew word is zecher. Now zecher in Hebrew does mean to remember, but it has a much broader meaning than it does in English. Zecher in Hebrew is to refer to something explicitly. To refer to something, you can refer to it with your mind, and that's to remember it. Or you can refer to it with your mouth, and that's to mention it. To explicitly to sum it up in your memory or to sum it up with your mouth. Now, Exodus 23:13 is the same word, and there it says, and the names of other gods you shall not zecher, nor shall they be heard upon your mouth. Now here it's very clear from the context that zecher does not mean to remember. It's not telling you don't remember Easter. It's telling you don't mention Easter, which I've just done now for educational purposes. But it's very clear from the context, it shall not be heard upon your mouth. You must not mention it. Don't even mention those names of the pagan gods. And when we're talking about the God of Israel, what it's saying is, this is my name forever. This is my zecher, my mention from generation to generation. What that means is, whenever we summon up His name, whether in our minds or in our mouths, whenever we refer to Him, we must refer to Him by His name, which is Yehovah, or others pronounce Yahweh. But it's very clear that His name is not Lord. That's just a title. Now, once I realized this, everything started to fall into place. Verses that I'd read 50 times, and I went over them before, and I never realized the significance of them. And that from these verses, it's very clear that the name of the Creator is not ineffable. For example, Deuteronomy 6:13 says, you shall fear Yehovah your God, and you shall worship Him, and in His name shall you swear. And others translate, in His name shall you make oaths. Now, after I realized that the name of the Creator is not ineffable, I realized, okay, how can you swear in His name if you're not allowed to pronounce His name? It's very clear from this verse that the name is not ineffable. It's not forbidden to pronounce the name of the Creator. In fact, that's how we're supposed to mention Him. We're supposed to refer to Him. Again, a second time, it says, Deuteronomy 10:20, Yehovah your God you shall fear, and Him you shall worship, and to Him shall you cling, and in His name shall you swear. Now, the practice of swearing in the name of the Creator, in the name of Yehovah, is something we see throughout the Tanakh. For example, in 1 Kings 2:23, we see that King Solomon makes a vow, and he says, so shall Yehovah do to me, and even more. Now, what does he mean by that? So shall Yehovah do to me and even more. First of all, by invoking the name of the Creator, he's swearing in the name, just like it says in Deuteronomy. So shall Yehovah do to me and even more. And what he means by that is he's laying a curse upon himself, saying that if I'm lying, may Yehovah do to me X, Y, Z. It doesn't even tell us what the X, Y, Z is. That's not the point of the story. So shall Yehovah do to me and even more than that, and even worse than that. Another vow formula we see throughout the Tanakh is what the vow that King David uses in 1 Samuel 20 verse 3. And there King David says, as Yehovah lives, he's making a vow in the name of the Creator, Yehovah, saying, as Yehovah lives. And what he means by this vow is, if I'm lying by my very actions, I'm denying the life of the Creator. That's a very serious vow. And the opposite is also true. If I'm telling the truth by my very actions, I'm declaring the life of the Creator. Now, this vow formula, as Yehovah lives, is actually related to a very important end times prophecy, which appears in Jeremiah 12:16. And this verse was always fascinating to me, this whole passage, because if you read the passage, this is one of the few verses in the entire Tanakh, in the entire Old Testament, which is explicitly and exclusively speaking to the Gentiles. This is a verse that has absolutely nothing to do with me. This is a promise to the Gentiles for the end time. And there it says, and it shall be if they nevertheless learn the way of my people to swear in my name as Yehovah lives, if the Gentiles will learn to swear as Yehovah lives, in the way they taught my people to swear by Baal, meaning the Gentiles used to swear as Baal lives, and they came and they taught that practice to Israel. If those same nations will learn to swear as Yehovah lives, then they shall be built into my people. That's a very important end-time prophecy for the nations, that they'll be built into Israel if they'll learn to swear as Yehovah lives. Now, you should be getting a little bit nervous here right now because Jesus has forbidden you to swear under any circumstances, and if you swear, you're from the evil one, according to the Greek Jesus. But let's see what it says in the Hebrew. In Hebrew, Matthew 5, we read, you have further heard what was said by the ancients, you shall not swear falsely by my name. That's a direct quote, word for word, from Leviticus 19:12. But you must pay your vow to Yehovah, which is a paraphrase of Deuteronomy 23:21. And then he goes on and he says, but I say that you must not swear by anything falsely. Falsely is what he says in the Hebrew. So in the Hebrew, he's not prohibiting vows, he's prohibiting false vows. Not by the earth, which is his footstool, meaning you must not say, I swear by the earth, and be lying. You have to be telling the truth if you swear by the earth. Nor by Jerusalem, which is his footstool. Nor by your head, because you cannot make one hair white or black, but let your yes be yes, and your no, no. Anything added to this is evil. And we'll get back to anything added to this is evil in a minute. But in verse 37, he starts off saying, let your yes be yes, and your no, no. Now, he's not talking about making vows here. He's talking about making false vows. So when he says, let your yes be yes, what he means is, in this new context, is if you say, I swear by Jerusalem, yes, I will do such and such, that better be a true yes. That better not be a false yes. And if you say, no, I swear by the throne of God, I will do such and such, that better be a no. You better not be lying there. Now, why would he need to tell us that not to make false vows? Or why would he need to tell you not to make false vows? Isn't it obvious that you shouldn't make false vows? That's pretty obvious. But what happened apparently is in that period, some Pharisees came along and they said, okay, it says in Leviticus 19:12, you shall not swear falsely by my name. So if I don't use the name, I'm allowed to swear falsely. That's what the Pharisees were teaching in this period, that you're allowed to swear falsely as long as you don't use the name, because it says by my name. And anyway, they don't use the name, so they can swear falsely all day long. Now, what Yahshua is saying is, no, when it says in Scripture not to swear falsely by my name, it doesn't mean you can swear falsely by other things. Yes, as a keeper of Torah, you're supposed to be swearing by the name of the Creator. That's what we read in Deuteronomy. But if you're going to swear by other things, that doesn't mean you're allowed to lie. The principle behind this commandment is not to swear falsely. Even if you don't use the name, you're not supposed to swear falsely. And I think that's obvious to anybody who uses common sense and looks at this in its context, that this is not a permission to vow falsely or to swear falsely. Simply, the way that an Israelite should be swearing is by the name, and if you're swearing by the name, you must not swear falsely. And all Yahshua is doing here, he's bringing out the underlying Torah principle, saying, no, what you Pharisees are doing, opening up these loopholes, saying I'm allowed to swear falsely, that's not the point of the commandment. You're over-literalizing it, you're taking the words and disembodying them from the context and from the meaning behind what it's saying. You're only taking the words and not the spirit of what it's really saying, which is the contextual meaning that anyone with common sense would understand. Now, there's no doubt that 2,000 years ago when Yahshua said this, he would have been accused by the Pharisees of adding to the Torah, because they said it does say by my name, and if you tell me I can't swear falsely by Jerusalem, where does it say that in Scripture? Now, to anyone who uses their common sense, to the simple Israelite shepherd or farmer who comes and hears, you shall not swear falsely by my name, it's obvious that you can't swear falsely by other things as well. That's obvious. But to the Pharisees, that's not so obvious, because to them Scripture is a divine code. And Yahshua wanted to make it very clear that he's not adding to Torah. He's just bringing out the underlying Torah principle, and that's why he ends his statement saying anything added to this is evil. He wouldn't add anything to the Torah because that would be evil. And this is simply a paraphrase of Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 2. Do not add anything to the Torah or take away. And Yahshua is simply reiterating this basic Torah principle. Now, what we have in the Greek, Matthew, like it or not, is an abolition of vows. Jesus is coming along and abolishing vows. You're forbidden to swear by anything. That's a fact. That's what he says there. In the Hebrew Matthew, on the other hand, we have an abolition of false vows. That's a very different message, isn't it? A very different statement. He's not abolishing vows, he's abolishing false vows. And really what we see is the Greek Jesus, as he's called in the Greek Jesus, is abolishing entire Torah commandments. Don't worry about adding to the Torah. Obey whatever the Pharisees tell you to do. And don't worry about making, don't worry about vowing in the name of the Creator. Don't vow at all. That's what I'm telling you. Don't swear at all. Whereas we've now uncovered Hebrew Yahshua, the words of Yahshua as he's portrayed in the Hebrew, and there he's upholding Torah. He's saying their claim to authority as they sit in the seat of Moses, do as Moses says, do as he says. And they're telling you that you can jump through these loopholes and swear falsely. No, that's not the point of the commandment. The point of the commandment is not to swear falsely at all. Not to swear falsely. Now, you as believers need to make a real decision, you have to ask yourself a question. The Greek Jesus is changing the Torah, adding, taking away, abolishing, modifying. The Hebrew Yahshua is upholding the Torah. You need to make the decision and ask yourself the question, who are you going to believe? You can't just ignore the Greek and you can't just ignore the Hebrew. They're both there. You need to make the real conscious decision, who are you going to believe? Are you going to believe the Greek Jesus that's changing Torah or the Hebrew Yahshua who's upholding Torah? And by the way, I don't want anyone to walk away from here tonight and says, Nehemia claims that there were two people who walked the earth and taught 2,000 years ago, one named Jesus, the other named Yahshua. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is the way his words are portrayed in the Greek is fundamentally different than how the words are portrayed in the Hebrew. And you need to decide which one of those statements you believe, what's portrayed in the Greek or what's portrayed in the Hebrew. Let me help you out with that decision there. Let's look at Hebrew Matthew chapter 23, verses 16 and on. And there Yahshua is speaking to the Pharisees throughout Matthew 23. And there he says to the Pharisees, woe to you, you blind chairs. You can look in your Greek and you'll see it says, woe to you, you blind guides. In the Hebrew, he says, you blind chairs. Remember Matthew 23, verse 2, he said they sit in the seat of Moses. And now he's calling them the blind chairs. Yeah, you're sitting in that seat, but you're blind chairs. Woe to you, you blind chairs, who say that he who swears by the sanctuary is not obligated. Does that sound familiar? Swear by the sanctuary is not obligated. In other words, if you say, I swear by the temple in Jerusalem, you're allowed to lie because you haven't used the name. Who say that he who swears by the sanctuary is not obligated, but he who vows by anything is sanctified to the sanctuary building is obligated to pay. Meaning if you make a vow to bring something to the temple, then you have to pay it. Well, that's very convenient, isn't it? Madmen and blind men, which is greater, the sanctuary or the thing which is sanctified to the sanctuary? And you say he who vows by the altar is not obligated. But he who vows to bring a sacrifice must give it. Meaning if you say, I swear by the altar in Jerusalem, then you're allowed to lie because you haven't used the name. But if you swear to bring a sheep to the altar, then you have to give it because some of the priests were Pharisees and the Pharisees have got to eat. So it's a simple economic consideration. Which is greater, the sacrifice of the altar, the sanctuary of the sacrifice? And this next verse, verse 20, is really, I think, the decisive verse. There he says, he who swears by the altar swears by it and by all that is in it. So here he's actually upholding vows. Now what happened to if you make a vow by anything, you're from the evil one? That's not here at all. That's not reflected at all. He's saying if you make a vow, you must keep that vow. You must not swear falsely. Now, the reason this is so significant is because in the Greek, in the very same verse in Greek Matthew, he says, therefore he who swears by the altar swears by it and by everything on it. In other words, in the Greek, he's saying the exact same thing as he's saying in the Hebrew on this particular verse, upholding vows. Meaning that in Matthew 23, 16 to 20, both in the Greek and the Hebrew, Yahshua is saying no to false vows, yes to true vows. Well, what happened to anybody who swears is from Satan? That's not being reflected here even in the Greek. So let's summarize what we have here. Against vows, we have Greek Matthew 5, and by the way, Greek James 5:12, which is a paraphrase of Greek Matthew 5. In favor of vows, we have the Torah. That's a pretty significant one. We have Jeremiah 12:16. Hebrew Matthew 5, Hebrew Matthew 23, and then even Greek Matthew 23. So what you can see is the Hebrew, or the Greek, the Hebrew is consistent with itself and it's consistent with the Torah. He's against false vows, in favor of true vows, whereas the Greek is not even consistent with itself. In Matthew 5, he's against vows altogether. In Matthew 23, he's upholding vows. So the Greek is not even internally consistent. And you need to make the decision, who are you going to believe? The Hebrew Yahshua, how Yeshua's words are portrayed in the Hebrew, or the Greek Jesus, the way he's portrayed in the Greek? Now, everything I talked about up till now is described in much greater detail in my book, The Hebrew Yeshua versus the Greek Jesus. And now you understand the title, that the way his words are portrayed in the Hebrew is different than how they're portrayed in the Greek. And now I want to talk about a few things which are not discussed in my book, but they're going to be discussed in my next book, which I'm writing right now. And the first thing I want to talk about are the manuscripts of Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew. And one of the things that we find is that Hebrew Matthew was published in 1987 along with an English translation. And when it was published based on 9 manuscripts. And of those 9 manuscripts, you find that over time, the manuscripts go through a process called assimilation to the Greek. And what that means is that they start out very different from the Greek, and over time, a Hebrew scribe comes along and says, wait a minute, that's not what it's supposed to say in the Hebrew. That's not what it's supposed to say in Matthew. And why does he say that? Because he's read the Greek. And what he ends up doing is changing the Hebrew to match the Greek. So for example, in Hebrew Matthew 5:34, we saw the sentence that makes sense, that Yeshua's original words were, I say to you that you must not swear by anything falsely. Well, some Hebrew scribes came along, and in some manuscripts, when they were copying them, they said, wait a minute, I know it doesn't say falsely in the Greek. And what they did is they deleted this word. And you end up with the Greek reading in the Hebrew, I say to you that you must not swear by anything, which doesn't make sense. Now, the reason this is important is that of the 9 manuscripts that were published, 2 of these are very close to the Hebrew original words of Yeshua, meaning that when you compare them systematically with the Greek, you find many differences, and when the Greek doesn't make sense, the Hebrew does. Whereas the other manuscripts that were published have been highly assimilated to the Greek, meaning that in many places, not consistently, but in many places where the original Hebrew words make perfect sense and differ from the Greek, in these 7 other manuscripts, they've been adapted and modified, assimilated to match the Greek. And really, of these 9 manuscripts, these 2, the one in the British Library and the other one which is designated Manuscript C, are really the 2 most important manuscripts. And all these nuggets of truth and information that we're finding consistently appear in these manuscripts. And the other manuscripts, they appear haphazardly. Sometimes it's been modified, sometimes it hasn't. And what that means is out of the 9 manuscripts, 2 are really the most important. Why is it important? Because there's more than 9 manuscripts. From my preliminary research, I've been able to find that there are at least 23 manuscripts of Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew. And these are actually specific designations of manuscripts from around the world. For example, you can go to London to the Montefiore Library and ask to see manuscript number 286, and that's a manuscript of Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew. And these other 14 manuscripts have never been published. Now, if the first 9 manuscripts, if 2 out of those contain all these nuggets of truth and information, who knows what's in these other 14 manuscripts? No one knows. They haven't been studied, and until they're actually published, we won't know what information will come out of these manuscripts. The next thing I want to talk about is the question of the age of a manuscript versus the age of composition. That's a very important topic that we have to understand. This is a basic concept in textual studies, that the age that something was copied, the date that a manuscript was copied, very often differs from the date that it was originally written. For example, if you open up to the World Almanac and Book of Facts from 2005, that book was printed in 2005. However, if you turn to the Declaration of Independence, that was copied and printed in 2005, but it was originally written in what year? In 1776. So although the age of the manuscript, or in this case the printing, is 2005, the original date of composition is 1776. Why is it important? Because Shem Tov Ibn Shaprut copied Hebrew Matthew in 1380. That doesn't mean that he wrote Hebrew Matthew or composed Hebrew Matthew in 1380. Now, let's look at some other examples of this. Josephus Flavius is a famous Jewish historian who lived in the 1st century, and he wrote a history of the Jews called Antiquities of the Jews, and that was written in the 1st century. However, our earliest complete manuscript, or earliest manuscript of Antiquities of the Jews, is only from the 10th century, 900 years after he wrote his original book. Now, the original book written in the hand of Josephus, that's been gone for more than 1,000 years. And the reason for that is that manuscripts very often will not last more than a few hundred years, and if they're not copied, and copies made of those copies, and copies made of those copies, then the book won't survive. And in this case, the earliest manuscript of Antiquities of the Jews is from the 10th century, even though no one in the world denies that this book was written in the 1st century. Here's another interesting example. The earliest complete manuscript of Isaiah is from the 1st century before the Common Era, from the Dead Sea Scrolls. However, Isaiah wrote his book and prophesied 700 years earlier. The original book written by Isaiah, that's long gone. That's been gone for more than 2,000 years. Our earliest complete copy is from only 700 years after Isaiah wrote his book. And the significance of this is that although Shem Tov Ibn Shaprut copied Hebrew Matthew in 1380, the linguistic and textual evidence proved that it's much earlier than 1380, and in many cases more original than the Greek version.
In the course of our final 2 episodes, I will present some of the most profound words ever spoken on planet Earth. Don't miss our 2-part grand finale of the 10-part series, Raiders of the Lost Book, Discoveries in the Ancient Hebrew Text of Matthew's Gospel. This is Michael Rood in the Galilee, bidding you shalom, peace, and I will see you when the smoke clears.